Hamilton, Ontario, a city built on fire and iron. At its peak, one company employed 26,000 people here, more workers than some Canadian cities had residents. The Steel Company of Canada, Stelco. Its name was stamped on the railways that crossed the country, the bridges that spanned its rivers, the buildings that announced a young nation's ambition to the world. For 7 decades, it was the largest steel producer in Canada. Then the 2004 bankruptcy. Then the American buyer and his broken promises. Then the blast furnace that had roared for a century went cold, and the neighborhood around it fell silent in a way it never had before. This is the story of how 5 companies merged in a Hamilton rail yard in 1910 and built something that felt permanent. And the story of how foreign owners, pension debt, and a century of deferred decisions dismantled it, piece by piece, until only the name remained. The year is 1910. In Hamilton, Ontario, 5 companies that had spent decades competing against each other sat down and decided to stop. The Hamilton Steel and Iron Company, the Montreal Rolling Mills, the Canada Screw Company, the Canada Bolt and Nut Company, the Dominion Wire Manufacturing Company. Together, they became the Steel Company of Canada, Stelco. Instantly, on the day of its incorporation, one of the largest industrial enterprises in the country. The choice of Hamilton was not sentimental. It was geometric. The city sat at the western end of Lake Ontario, where ore could arrive by water from the mines of the Canadian Shield and coal could come north from the American Appalachian fields. The railways ran through it. The lake bordered it. Raw materials in, finished steel out, at the lowest possible cost. Geography was the first competitive advantage. The men who built the company understood that before they laid a single foundation. The first president, Charles Secord Wilcox, established a policy that would define the company's early character. Profits would not be paid out as dividends. They would go back into the plant, into new equipment, new capacity, new capability. It was a philosophy of reinvestment over extraction, of building something larger rather than taking something out. In the years that followed, that discipline paid. When the Canadian government raised tariffs on American steel imports through the 1920s and into the Depression years, Stelco was positioned to absorb the protection and grow through it. Competitors collapsed. Stelco did not. By the time the 1930s ended, it stood alone at the top of the Canadian steel industry, supplying the railways, the bridges, the buildings of a country that was still, in important ways, constructing itself. The foundation had been poured. What came next would be built on top of it for the next 40 years. War is good for steel. The First World War made that plain. When Britain went to war in August 1914 and Canada followed within days, the demand for shell steel turned Stelco from a successful domestic supplier into a critical instrument of Allied industrial power. The Hamilton Works ran at a pace the company had never attempted before. The orders did not stop. Neither did the furnaces. The interwar years brought consolidation. The tariff walls held. The domestic market was Stelco's by default and by scale. When the Depression arrived and demand collapsed across every sector, the company survived where others did not. The reinvestment philosophy that Wilcox had established in 1910 had left the company with modern equipment and no debt spiral to service. It was not comfortable, but it endured. Then the Second World War arrived and transformed everything again. New plate mills and hot strip mills went up in 1941. cold mills and tin mills followed in 1948. The Hilton Works in Hamilton, which had begun as a consolidation of 5 modest operations, became one of the most complete steel complex in North America. The kind of facility that could take raw ore at one end and produce finished sheet steel at the other without leaving the property. By the early 1970s, Stelco reported over $1 billion in annual sales. The workforce had grown to 24,000. Then came 1981. 26,000 workers on the payroll. The largest steel producer in Canada. The economic backbone of a city of 300,000 people. Walk the neighborhoods around Hilton Works in those years, and you understood what a single employer could do to a place. The houses were modest and well kept. The cars were new. The schools were full. The plant was the reason for all of it. That was the summit. That was as high as it ever got. On July 15, 1946, 13,000 steelworkers walked off the job at Hamilton Works. They wanted a 40-hour week, paid vacation, and formal recognition of their union. Stelco's management responded the way management responded in 1946. They hired strikebreakers, more than 2,000 of them, and they began moving supplies into the plant by boat across Lake Ontario. Because the picket lines controlled the gates, but not the water. The Union launched its own fleet, including, by most accounts, a vessel that had spent the Prohibition years running something other than legitimate cargo across the same lake. The company used an airplane to fly supplies over the lines and into the plant. The Union hired a former Spitfire pilot. He didn't drop bombs. He dropped leaflets, Union literature falling from the sky over the mill in slow, drifting arcs, while the men on the picket line watched from below. The leaflets floated down as a silent protest. On a Saturday in August, Hamilton's mayor Sam Lawrence led a march to the gates of Stelco. 10,000 people, among them hundreds of veterans of the Second World War, men who had come home from Europe and the Pacific the previous year, marching now in formation behind a labor mayor toward the fence of a steel plant. The optics were not lost on anyone. After 81 days, the workers voted. 2,173 in favor of accepting the agreement, and 112 against. Local 1005 of the United Steelworkers of America became permanently embedded in the company's identity from that moment forward. The local presence was now unmistakable. What the strike established was not just a contract. It established a pattern. One major walkout per decade, on average, for the next 50 years, 1958, 1966, 1969, 1981, 1990. The relationship between Stelco and its workers was never a partnership. It was a cold war with periodic eruptions. Everyone knew the next one was coming. The only question was when. 15 years of planning. 6 years of construction. In 1980, Stelco opened the Lake Erie Works near Nanticoke on the north shore of Lake Erie, 80 kilometers southwest of Hamilton. The price was $870 million. The ambition was explicit. This would be one of the most advanced steel mills in the world, a greenfield facility built from nothing on open farmland, designed for the future rather than inherited from the past. While Hamilton aged, Nanticoke would carry the company forward. It never got the chance. A strike in 1981 interrupted the ramp-up before it reached capacity. Then the recession arrived and removed the question entirely. The finishing lines that were supposed to complete the facility were never built. A plant designed to produce millions of tons annually never approached its potential. $870 million of future, sitting unfinished on the shore of Lake Erie, while the market that justified it evaporated. The 1981 recession hit the entire North American steel industry with the force of something structural rather than cyclical. Stelco laid off more than 7,000 workers out of a workforce of 25,000. Steel prices collapsed. Demand did not recover quickly or cleanly. What happened next was the decision that defined the decade. Rather than modernizing Hamilton Works, the aging complex that had been the company's foundation for 70 years, Stelco spent the 1980s diversifying into unrelated businesses. Capital and management attention moved away from steel at precisely the moment steel needed both. The falling trade barriers that arrived with new international agreements then exposed the company to cheaply produced foreign steel being dumped into the North American market for the first time. Hamilton was old. Nanticoke was incomplete. The competition was arriving from directions no tariff wall would stop. The foundation that had held since 1910 was beginning, quietly, to shift. In 2001, the North American steel industry collapsed. Not gradually. 40 producers filed for bankruptcy. Production capacity fell by nearly half. 400,000 jobs disappeared across the sector. It was the kind of structural failure that rewrites an industry permanently, and the companies that survived did so by making brutal decisions quickly. They restructured union contracts. They eliminated pension liabilities. They modernized their facilities. Stelco did none of these things effectively. It entered the crisis carrying everything it had accumulated and put nothing down. By 2004, the pension shortfall had reached $1.3 billion. Decades of obligations to thousands of retirees. Promises made during the good years when the furnaces ran hot and the orders came steady, now sitting on the balance sheet like a weight the company could no longer lift. In January 2004, Stelco entered creditor protection under the company's Creditors Arrangement Act. The filing was controversial from the start. The company was not technically insolvent. It argued that insolvency was imminent without court intervention. The distinction mattered to the lawyers. It did not impress the union. Then came the moment that defined the entire proceeding. Within weeks of the bankruptcy filing, steel prices surged. Stelco posted record profits. Union leaders who had fought the filing in court watched in disbelief as management discussed paying employee bonuses inside a company that was formally bankrupt. The proceedings lasted nearly 2 years. 70 court orders, 5 appellate decisions, more than 50 monitor reports. A record in Canadian insolvency history. The Ontario government injected $150 million into the pension shortfall to help the company exit creditor protection. A public bailout of a private empire. Stelco emerged in March 2006 with restructured debt and a reduced workforce. 1 year later, it lost $240 million. The bankruptcy had not been a cure. It had been an interval. The disease was still there, and it was still advancing. On August 27, 2007, U.S. Steel Corporation of Pittsburgh purchased Stelco for $1.9 billion. $1.1 billion in cash, $800 million in assumed debt. Nearly a century of Canadian ownership ended on a single transaction date. The promises arrived with the purchase agreement. Significant capital investment in both Hamilton and Nanticoke. A guarantee of the pension obligations that thousands of retirees depended on. The workers heard the commitments. They had heard commitments before. The management culture that arrived from Pittsburgh was described by workers at Lake Erie as something foreign and hostile. The Union president compared it to a foreign occupying force taking control of territory it had no intention of understanding. At Hamilton, the same sentiment ran through the plant floor. These were not partners arriving to build something. They were administrators arriving to assess something. 16 months after the acquisition closed, U.S. Steel announced the shutdown of Hamilton Works and most of the Lake Erie facility. More than 2,000 jobs eliminated in a single announcement. In 2010, steelmaking operations at Hamilton were permanently idled. The blast furnace that had burned continuously for decades went cold. The surrounding neighborhood, which had organized its entire rhythm around the sound and the light and the heat of that plant, fell silent in a way it had never been silent before. In 2013, all remaining steelmaking at Hamilton ceased permanently. In 2014, U.S. Steel Canada entered creditor protection for a second time. The pension deficit in Hamilton now covered more than 9,000 retirees against only 540 active workers. U.S. Steel moved quietly to isolate the pension liabilities and environmental cleanup costs in separate corporate structures while retaining Nanticoke. The Ontario government refused to forgive its $150 million loan. A former executive described what remained as a shell with no substance left. The promises had been the instrument. The extraction had been the plan. In 2017, the remnants of Stelco were sold to Bedrock Industries of the United States. The name was restored. The company returned to the Toronto Stock Exchange. The Hamilton workers accepted concessions on retiree benefits as the price of survival. In July 2024, Cleveland Cliffs acquired Stelco for approximately $2.5 billion. The transfer was complete. Canada's steel empire, built by immigrant labor in a Hamilton rail yard in 1910, now belonged entirely to American owners. The blast furnace is cold. The acres are quiet. The name survives. The country that built it kept the debt and the silence.